All right, so this is going to start our first actual bit of course content that's going to show up on the exam. So everything we've done up to this point has kind of been in what the College Board calls time periods 1 and 2. This starts our discussion of time period 3. And from this point forward, everything that we cover is fair game for the AP exam. So time period 3 takes us from the year 600 CE to about the year 1450. So 600 to 1450. This is the stuff that could possibly be on the exam. So now we're going to have to look at things a little bit more detailed because all of this stuff could possibly show up on the AP exam. And from this point forward, we're also going to be doing a little bit more detailed work in the textbook. So instead of you kind of being an expert on a chapter in a time period, now we're going to be looking pretty detailed in every chapter. So in your book, this is chapter 13. And chapter 13 is about East Asian empires. Most of our time in here is going to be spent talking about China, but we're also going to start looking a little bit at Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. So I think in what will be the fourth video on this chapter, we'll take a brief look at what's going on in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. But most of our time and most of our attention is going to be spent on China because, as we've been saying all along, China is the economic powerhouse of the world. And so we have to really understand what's going on in China. And this is the stuff that's going to be the first Chinese stuff that could appear on the exam. So it's now it's time to really focus in on stuff because this is stuff that could be asked of you on the exam. So we're going to pick up our story of China after the Han Dynasty. So after the Han Dynasty collapses, China again falls into a period of chaos. China breaks into 3 or 4 smaller kingdoms. Very similar to what happened after the Zhou Dynasty collapses and we get the period of warring states. After the Han Dynasty collapses, again, China breaks into 3 or 4 smaller kingdoms. It depends on what period you're looking at, but China again kind of falls into chaos. And just like we saw after the Zhou Dynasty collapse and we get the period of warring states, one of the smaller kingdoms manages to reunite China. And we get a new dynasty. And so this is known as the Sui Dynasty. The Sui Dynasty, which lasts from 581 to 618. So almost beat for beat, this is a repetition of what happened after the Zhou Dynasty collapsed. We get a period where one of these smaller kingdoms manages to put China back together, and that dynasty does not last very long. This one lasts a little bit longer than the Qin dynasty, but again, this one only lasts for what looks like 17 years, if my math is right. Or not 17, 37. 37 years. Again, not a really long time. And again, remember, if a government doesn't last very long, it's because they're doing something to make the people unhappy. And we're going to see a lot of the same stuff that the Qin did return in the Sui dynasty. So the Sui used a lot of Qin / legalist tactics. So they're going to do a lot of the same stuff the Qin did. They're going to have high taxes, forced labor, harsh punishments, all the stuff that the Qin used to reunite China after the period of warring states, the Sui are going to do again. Unlike the Qin, though, the Sui did leave one important, lasting legacy. And that is the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal links northern China with southern China. Most of the rivers in China go from west to east. And so the rivers kind of served as natural transportation routes. But there weren't any natural transportation routes that linked northern China with southern China. And so the one thing that the Sui did that the rest of China really appreciated was building the Grand Canal. So this was built during this 37-year reign of the Sui dynasty. It's still in use today. So it's still used by China today to move things around China. Now, obviously, there are other more efficient ways of moving things around China today, but it's still there and it still works, so they still use it. Now, as you can imagine, the people did not like this, just like they didn't like the Qin dynasty. They didn't like the Sui's tactics, and so there were rebellions. And there were also a lot of failed military campaigns. And remember, these are expensive. So it's like they just wasted a lot of money. And so that also leads to more rebellions. And so when the emperor was assassinated, we get a rebellion that restores kind of some of the Han traditional government. So some of the stuff that the Han were doing, the emperor, the Sui emperor, when he's assassinated, a rebellion comes and it restores kind of what the Han were doing. And so this dynasty is going to last a long time, just like the Han did. And this one is known as the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty goes from 618 to 907. And it's going to reflect a lot of the same stuff the Han did. So remember, we get kind of a repetition of what we just saw. So there was chaos, and then this group came in and put things back together. The people didn't like them, and then there was a rebellion, and then we get a long-lasting government that's, again, going to put in place a lot of the same stuff the Han did. So history is repeating itself here in China. So the Tang Dynasty was a long period of stability and prosperity. And there were generally three reasons for this. So there were three big reasons for their success. A lot of this is going to sound familiar because it's basically what empires need to do to maintain order and stability and keep the people happy. So the first one of these is they had a big focus on transportation. So they built and maintained the roads. So they built new roads, they maintained old roads. They kind of built, I guess we'll call them inns, but kind of think of them as like rest stops for merchants. And this allowed them to get fuel and rest for their animals. And doing this really highlighted the idea that they wanted to encourage trade. Because if you encourage trade, that means the government gets more taxes. So if the government encourages trade through building the roads and building these inns for merchants, people will see China as a place that they want to trade in, and the government will reap the benefits of that by taxing the trade. Now, again, just like the Romans, the transportation wasn't just used for trade. It also allowed for faster communication and military movement. So remember, merchants aren't the only ones using the roads. The government is using them to communicate. The military is using them to move their forces around. Roads are good for everybody. Another reason that the Tang were so successful is that they really built up this bureaucracy of merit. Bureaucracy of merit. So they reintroduced and reinforced the Confucian education system. And part of that was these like really grueling exams to become a bureaucrat. If you wanted to become a government official, you had to pass these really hard exams. They lasted for days. And there are even cases of people being so stressed out and kind of malnourished while they take these exams that they died taking the tests. So these were very difficult tests to pass, but if you could pass them and become a bureaucrat, well, that meant that you got your life improved, and that benefited your community. Because you're getting a good amount of money by being a bureaucrat, and your social standing goes up. And remember that for East Asian societies, the community matters a lot. And so your community benefits by you becoming a bureaucrat. So your community, sometimes communities would collect money to send their smartest kids to go take the exam, because that would benefit everyone in the community. Another really good thing about the bureaucracy of merit was that anyone could become a government official, because only the smartest people were allowed to do this. And of course, when I say anyone, I mean any man. Women weren't allowed to do this. One other reason why the Tang were so successful is that the Tang figured out a way to help poor people have some money. Because remember, one of the big reasons that the Han Dynasty collapsed and the Roman Dynasty, or the Roman Empire collapsed, was that there was this growing gap between the rich and the poor. So the Tang figured out a way, not maybe the best way, but they figured out a way to kind of shrink the gap between rich and poor. And the way they did that was through land distribution. They would give people a plot of land, and they could use that to farm on and principally not starve. But if they are really efficient and really focused on doing the work, they might even make some extra money. And, maybe move up in society. It was possible to move up in society. If you were really industrious, you might be able to move up a little bit. But the general sense of this is that at very least, if the government gives you a little bit of land, you're not going to starve to death. And if you're not starving, you are less likely to rebel. So here's how the system worked. It was called the equal field system. It's called the equal field system. And you were given a piece of land, the size depended on your need. So if you had a really big family, you'd get a little bit bigger pieces of land. If you had a smaller family, you would have a smaller piece of land. And you personally get to keep 20% of it. That is yours to keep. The rest is borrowed from the government. So even if everybody in the family dies, you personally, as the head of the household, get to keep 20%. That is yours. The rest of it you're borrowing from the government to plant on, to farm on. If your circumstances change, you may have to give some back or get some more. But you now own a little piece of land, 20% of what they gave you. Now this is great because now everybody has a little bit of land. No one is going to starve to death because you get to keep the food that you grow personally on your plot of land. But there are some problems with this. First, you constantly need more land to give away. Like, there's not an infinite amount of land. You constantly need to get more land, which kind of requires you to go out and conquer, which we'll talk about more in a second. Another problem with this is that you could easily bribe government officials into giving you more land or letting you keep more. Even though Confucianism says you should always do the right thing in every situation, not everybody is going to do that. So you could pretty easily bribe people into giving you more land or letting you keep more of your land, or maybe helpfully forgetting the fact that, you know, somebody died in your family and letting you keep the land that that person would have accounted for in terms of the land distribution. But that's a problem for later people. Right now, we've figured out a way to keep people relatively happy and relatively well fed. So for right now, the Tang Dynasty is killing it. They know what they're doing and they're keeping their people happy. Now, remember that the Tang Dynasty had to continuously gather more land. So one of the things that the Tang Dynasty is remembered for is a period of military expansion. In fact, during the Tang Dynasty, China is at its biggest. China is at its biggest during the Tang Dynasty. It's even bigger. It was bigger then than it is now. So they are going to expand into places like Korea and Vietnam, Tibet, and big pieces of Central Asia. So China is China, but it's also now going to take over pieces of Korea and Vietnam and Tibet and Central Asia, much bigger than its current borders are right now. Their military success led them to get kind of arrogant. And the Chinese considered themselves to be what was called the Middle kingdom. Meaning that they are at the center of the world. They are at the center. Anyone that they conquered entered into a complicated relationship, a complicated political and economic relationship called the kowtow. Basically, what the kowtow was a ritual humiliation. So essentially what happens is the conquered people's representative, sometimes their leader, maybe an ambassador, is brought before the Tang emperor, and the representative of the conquered people gets on his knees and bows deeply 3 times in front of the emperor, each time putting his forehead on the ground. After that's done, there is a kind of ritual exchange of gifts. And at that point, after they do this, the people, the conquered people, can now trade with China and pretty much rule themselves as they see fit. In fact, a lot of people, but not all of them, but a lot of people wanted to do this in order to trade with China. And as they interact more with the people around them, this leads to a lot of cultural and economic diffusion. So, like the Romans and the Greeks in the Mediterranean, the Chinese are kind of acting as a bridge for cultural and economic diffusion. Ideas from all around Asia are going to flow in and out of China. Trade goods are going to flow in and out of China through this ritual humiliation of the kowtow. So China kind of acts the same way that Rome did or Greece did in the Mediterranean. They act as a bridge for a lot of this cultural diffusion. I think this is a good place to stop. In the next video, we'll talk about why the Tang eventually did decline and the dynasty that replaces them. And then we'll talk about the kind of general idea of the Chinese economy. So the Tang and Song, the Song Dynasty is the one that follows the Tang. We'll talk kind of generally about the Chinese economy during time period 3. So until then, I'm going to stop there. So this is Mr. Nissen signing off.